Introduction. Some of the most brilliant minds in history didn't just dream, they created. They solved problems that no one else dared to take on. And then, their work was confiscated, forgotten, buried under a false name. Today, we uncover the stories of inventions that changed everything, but whose creators were erased from memory. This is a story about geniuses and what can happen to them. Philo Farnsworth's electronic television. In the quiet farmland of Rigby, Idaho, a teenage boy stood in a field in 1921, contemplating lines of plowed soil. That boy was Philo Taylor Farnsworth, just 14 years old, and his mind wasn't on farming. It was focused on a vision, an idea that would one day change the world, even if the world would take decades to realize it. He imagined a machine that could capture moving images, break them into lines, and reassemble them as light and shadow. While others tinkered with mechanical spinning discs and motors, Farnsworth saw something more elegant. He imagined the first fully electronic television. By the time he was 21, Farnsworth had not only designed this machine but built it. In 1927, in a small lab in San Francisco, he successfully transmitted the first live electronic television image. A simple straight line. It may seem small now, but in that moment, Farnsworth had achieved what others thought impossible. His invention was pure science. No spinning discs, no moving parts, just electricity, glass, and brilliance. What set Farnsworth apart was that he didn't simply build upon the ideas of others. His approach was fundamentally different. While others relied on mechanical systems, his vision was electronic from the start. He developed the image dissector tube, a revolutionary component that used electrons to scan and reconstruct images. He built the future in a room full of vacuum tubes. But even genius cannot always outpace power. Enter RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, led by David Sarnoff, a man not known for invention but for control. RCA had its own team of engineers working on television, including Vladimir Zworykin. Zworykin had been working on a similar concept but had not succeeded in making it function. In 1930, Farnsworth was granted a key patent for his image dissector tube. RCA took notice. Sarnoff, determined to control the television market, sent engineers to meet Farnsworth. RCA wanted his patents. Farnsworth declined. What followed was a series of long, bitter legal battles. RCA challenged his patents, attempting to invalidate them or force a settlement. But in 1934, the U.S. Patent Office ruled in Farnsworth's favor. He had priority. He had truly invented electronic television. For a moment, it looked as if justice had been done. Farnsworth had defended his work and secured his legacy. But patents have limits. They expire. And so do resources. RCA, with its vast corporate network and financial strength, eventually overwhelmed Farnsworth. His invention became the standard, but his name faded from the public eye. When RCA began mass production of televisions in the 1940s, they used his technology without his name. Farnsworth continued to work on science throughout his life. He dreamed of new ways to harness energy and improve humanity's understanding of the universe. In the 1950s and 60s, he turned to nuclear fusion, creating devices he believed could produce limitless clean energy. But those dreams, too, were underfunded, overlooked, and quietly dismissed by mainstream institutions. He saw the world embrace television but felt only bitterness in how it was used. In his final years, Farnsworth reportedly told his wife that he regretted inventing it. What he had hoped would be a tool for education and enlightenment had become, in his view, a source of distraction and triviality. Philo Farnsworth died in 1971. For decades, his name remained unfamiliar to most who watched the images his mind had made possible. In 2007, a statue of him was placed in the U.S. Capitol's National Statuary Hall, a quiet gesture of recognition for a man whose vision shaped the 20th century. His story is not just about invention. It is about how ideas move through history, how they are nurtured or neglected, protected or stolen. Farnsworth saw the future with startling clarity. He built it in silence. And though the world watched his creation, it took far too long to see the man behind the screen. Antonio Meucci's telephone. In a modest home on Staten Island in the mid-19th century, an aging Italian inventor worked in quiet obscurity. His name was Antonio Meucci. His hands, once calloused from theatrical set construction and chemical experiments, now delicately shaped copper wires and glass tubes. Around him, parts of an unfinished world gathered: coils, diaphragms, magnets, pieces of a device he had imagined long before most could even conceive it. It was not a hobby. It was his life's calling. Meucci was building something extraordinary, a way to transmit the human voice over distance, not by courier, not by written word, but by electrical signal. He called it the Telegraph. Meucci had been born in Florence in 1808 and trained as an engineer and stage technician. He immigrated to Cuba and later to the United States, driven by curiosity and the pursuit of better opportunities. Settling in New York, he applied his knowledge to a variety of experiments. Some involved therapeutic electrical devices, others, sound transmission. But in 1854, when his wife Esther became bedridden from severe illness, the nature of his experiments shifted from curiosity to necessity. Unable to leave her alone for long periods, Meucci began working on a device that would allow them to communicate between floors of their home. Using copper wiring, a rudimentary microphone, and a receiver constructed from materials at hand, he developed a prototype that could carry vibrations from his voice to her room. It worked. Voice traveled along wires, imperfectly, faintly, but audibly. It was a breakthrough, and it was a full 2 decades before the name Alexander Graham Bell would be associated with anything similar. Over the years, Meucci refined his design. He documented everything in detailed notebooks, carefully sketched mechanisms, and even demonstrated the device for local observers. But financing remained elusive. He was not a wealthy man. Materials cost money. Patents cost even more. In 1871, Meucci scraped together what he could to file a caveat, a temporary legal notice of his intention to patent the invention. It was a placeholder, not a full patent. He could not afford more than that. The caveat expired in 2 years, and he was unable to renew it. Desperate, Meucci approached Western Union, hoping they might be interested in funding his work. He submitted his prototype and documentation to the company for consideration. But time passed, and there was no response. When he requested his materials back, he was told they had been lost. Then, in 1876, came the patent that would change history. Alexander Graham Bell, a young inventor and speech teacher, filed a full patent for a device to transmit voice electrically. It was awarded. Bell became a household name. The Bell Telephone Company was founded shortly after. Meucci, reading the description of Bell's device, recognized something horrifyingly familiar. The concepts, the terminology, it mirrored what he had spent decades developing. Meucci attempted to defend his claim. He filed lawsuits, produced witnesses, and revealed his old designs and the caveat. Legal proceedings began in 1885, with the U.S. government launching a case to invalidate Bell's patent on grounds of fraud and prior art. Meucci was now in his 70s, weakened by age and poverty. Despite mounting evidence in his favor, the legal system was slow, burdened by the massive influence and financial power of the Bell monopoly. Before the case could reach conclusion, Meucci died in 1889. The lawsuit faded, unresolved. Bell retained his status as the inventor of the telephone. Meucci's notebooks and devices were scattered and eventually lost to history. His name, too, faded from public consciousness, reduced to a footnote in obscure texts. For more than a century, the name Antonio Meucci remained largely unknown outside of specialized historical circles. His contribution was buried under the weight of corporate success and institutional memory. In Italy, he was revered in academic communities, but internationally, his legacy remained in shadow. It wasn't until June 11, 2002, that recognition finally came. The United States House of Representatives passed Resolution 269, acknowledging the life and work of Antonio Meucci. It stated that his early work in voice transmission and his 1871 caveat should be honored, and that had he been able to afford a full patent, he might have been known today as the true inventor of the telephone. But for Meucci, that honor came far too late. Recognition, once withheld, does not always restore what was lost. The world moved forward using a technology he helped give birth to, yet his name was absent from the lineage taught in schools or written on the devices that eventually connected the globe. His story is one of brilliance unmet by privilege, of discovery overshadowed by power. Antonio Meucci's life reminds us that invention is not only about what is created, but about who has the means to protect and claim it. His device transmitted more than just sound. It carried the hopes of an aging man, the needs of a sick wife, and a vision of a connected world. Though his voice was nearly erased from the history he helped shape, it continues to echo, quietly, insistently, through every word spoken across a telephone line. Hedy Lamarr's frequency hopping. In the golden age of Hollywood, Hedy Lamarr's face became iconic. She was hailed as one of the most beautiful women ever to grace the silver screen, luminous, poised, and exotic. Moviegoers saw her as a star, a glamorous figure draped in elegance. But beyond the image projected on the screen lived a very different mind. A mind drawn not to lights and cameras, but to equations, diagrams, and inventions. Born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914, she showed signs of mechanical brilliance from a young age. While other children played with dolls, she disassembled music boxes to understand their gears. Her father, a bank director, encouraged her curiosity. He took long walks with her through the streets of Vienna, explaining how streetcars worked, how engines turned, how machines moved the world. These early conversations etched a blueprint in her imagination. A blueprint she would return to in secret, behind the glamorous veil of stardom. Lamarr fled Austria in the 1930s, escaping a controlling marriage to arms manufacturer Fritz Mandl. She arrived in the United States with a new name and a contract from MGM. Almost overnight, she became a sensation. But Hollywood, in its hunger for glamour, had little interest in intellect. In interviews, she was expected to smile. On set, she was told to speak softly, move slowly, and keep her brilliance hidden. So she worked at night, in her dressing room between takes, in her home laboratory, alone. During World War II, Lamarr's inventive instincts took on new urgency. German U-boats were torpedoing Allied ships in the Atlantic, and conventional radio-controlled torpedoes were vulnerable to jamming. If the enemy could detect the signal, they could block or manipulate it. Lamarr, disturbed by these vulnerabilities, began to imagine an alternative, a way for torpedoes to remain guided, but invisible to interception. She partnered with George Antheil, an avant-garde composer known for synchronizing player pianos. Together, they devised a radical concept. What if radio signals could hop between frequencies, too rapidly and unpredictably for enemies to track or jam? Their system involved synchronizing the transmitter and receiver to jump between 88 different frequencies in a prearranged pattern, just like two-player pianos keeping perfect time. In 1942, they filed a patent for their secret communication system. It was a marvel of early encryption, an application of music and physics combined. The goal was military defense. Lamarr wanted to contribute to the war effort not with her image, but with her intellect. She offered the patent to the U.S. Navy, but the Navy declined. They told her that, as an actress, she would be more useful selling war bonds. The technology, they said, was too complex. It was shelved, filed away, left unexplored. Lamarr, deeply disappointed, returned to the world of cinema. She kept inventing quietly, designing improved traffic lights and tablet-based soda systems. But none of these gained serious attention. Decades passed. The war ended. Lamarr faded from Hollywood's spotlight. She grew older, reclusive. Her contributions to science remained invisible, buried beneath the persona crafted by studios. Then, in the late 20th century, the world began to catch up to her. Engineers developing modern wireless communication revisited Lamarr's old patent. Her concept of frequency hopping, dismissed in the 1940s, now formed the backbone of spread-spectrum technology. This principle became critical to the development of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. The quiet diagrams she sketched in wartime became foundational in the global communications revolution. In the 1990s, Lamarr finally began to receive recognition from the scientific community. She was awarded the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award in 1997, just 3 years before her death. She did not attend the ceremony. Instead, she accepted the award by phone, the very device her ideas had helped transform. Lamarr passed away in 2000, at the age of 85. By then, the Internet had already reshaped society, and mobile devices were beginning their rise. Technologies she never lived to see had roots in her forgotten patent. Her story, once obscured by stereotype and dismissal, slowly emerged, not just as a curiosity, but as a case study in how genius can be overlooked when it wears the wrong face. She was never trained as an engineer. She held no university degrees. Yet her thinking was abstract, structural, and logical. She understood systems, not only how they worked, but how they could be reimagined. Lamarr's frequency hopping was ahead of its time, too sophisticated for the military institutions of her day, and too radical to be taken seriously from a woman outside the establishment. Her legacy today is not just the silent echo of a hidden invention. It's a reminder that ideas know no boundaries, not of gender, status, or origin. Innovation does not always wear a lab coat. Sometimes, it wears a silk gown under studio lights, sketching in notebooks between rehearsals, dreaming of signals that move unseen through the air. Hedy Lamarr's story lives now not in the beauty projected onto cinema screens, but in the invisible frameworks of modern communication. Every time a phone call connects, every time a GPS pin drops, every time Bluetooth finds a signal, a fragment of her vision pulses silently in the background, forgotten once, but never truly gone. Alan Turing's universal machine. In a quiet corner of Cambridge in the 1930s, a young mathematician sat alone with pen and paper, reshaping the limits of what was thought computable. Alan Turing, a name now etched into the foundation of modern computer science, was, at the time, just a doctoral student. His manner was awkward, his speech hesitant, and his thoughts abstract. But inside his mind lived a concept that would one day redefine the nature of machines, of information, and of intelligence itself. Turing's breakthrough came not with wires or machines, but with pure logic. In 1936, he published a paper titled On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Inventions. At its heart was a hypothetical device, a machine that could read and write symbols on an infinite strip of tape, moving back and forth according to a finite set of rules. It had no physical form. It needed no electricity. It was an idea, an abstraction, but it had power. He called it the universal machine. This device, he proposed, could perform any computation that could be defined by an algorithm. It could simulate the work of any other machine, given the right instructions. Though theoretical, it offered a model for how any complex problem could be broken down into simple operations. In this way, Turing didn't just imagine a machine. He imagined the very essence of computation, long before the first computers were built. At the time, Turing's concept was met with quiet curiosity. The paper was dense, deeply mathematical, and far removed from practical concerns. No one imagined the modern world that would one day run on digital code. Turing himself saw beyond the horizon. But his genius, like his machine, was abstract, brilliant, but disconnected from the institutions around him. A few years later, war changed everything. By 1939, Turing had joined Britain's secretive code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. The Nazis were using the Enigma machine to encrypt military communications, a cipher thought to be unbreakable. But Turing, drawing upon his theoretical work, designed an electromechanical device known as the bomb. It worked not by brute force, but by logic, systematically testing configurations to decipher the daily settings of Enigma. It was a physical embodiment of the thinking machine he had once imagined on paper. The bomb, and the people who worked with it, saved countless lives. To shorten the war. But it was a secret. Turing's contributions were classified. His name remained unknown to the public. No medals, no interviews, only silence. After the war, Turing continued his work on computing. He designed one of the earliest blueprints for a digital, stored program computer, a real-world universal machine. At the University of Manchester, he developed software for early computers like the Ferranti Mark I. He also began exploring ideas even more radical: machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the question of whether machines could think. In 1950, he proposed what is now called the Turing test, a method to determine whether a machine's behavior could be indistinguishable from that of a human. It was not a gimmick or a trick. It was a philosophical challenge, posed in precise terms. At its core was a simple but profound question. If a machine can think like us, what does that mean for us? But society was not ready for Alan Turing. In 1952, Turing was arrested for gross indecency under British law for being gay. He did not deny it. Instead, he was given a choice: imprisonment or chemical castration through hormone treatment. He chose the latter. It affected his health, his emotions, his ability to work. His security clearance was revoked. He was isolated, and his achievements went unacknowledged. 2 years later, in 1954, Turing was found dead from cyanide poisoning. The official verdict was suicide, though questions have lingered. His body was discovered in his home, beside a half-eaten apple. Some say he took his life deliberately. Others believe it was accidental. Either way, the world lost one of its most brilliant minds, quietly and without honor. For decades, his name remained obscure. The work he had done during the war was classified. The paper that had redefined the boundaries of logic was largely unknown outside academic circles. But the machines he imagined, the machines he designed, quietly multiplied. They spread across homes, schools, laboratories, and factories. Turing had not built one machine. He had given the world the blueprint for all of them. In time, recognition came. In 2009, the British government issued a formal apology for his treatment. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a royal pardon. In 2021, his face was printed on the Bank of England's £50 note. The note featured not only his portrait, but snippets of his code, and a diagram of his universal machine, the quiet, powerful idea that had once lived only in his mind. Today, every computer, from the largest server to the smallest phone, is a descendant of Turing's thought experiment. The logic gates that flicker billions of times per second follow the structure he imagined. The field of artificial intelligence owes its roots to the questions he first dared to ask. And yet, the world he helped create nearly forgot his name. Alan Turing's story is not one of triumph over adversity, but of brilliance ignored, punished, and ultimately rediscovered. His machine was never built in his lifetime. It didn't need to be. It lived in the language of mathematics, in the quiet symbols on paper, in the minds of those who came after. And now, in every calculation, every search, every act of computation, his vision lives on. Frank Sprague's electric elevator. In the intricate latticework of modern cities, skyscrapers stretch upward into the clouds. Glass and steel towers pierce the horizon, their upper floors filled with offices, apartments, and endless human activity. But the vertical city, the skyline we now take for granted, would not exist without a hidden, humming machine. An invention that quietly changed everything. The electric elevator. Before the world knew the name Otis, before the elevator became synonymous with mechanical safety, there was another name, largely forgotten, behind the real innovation that made vertical living possible: Frank Sprague. Born in 1857 in Milford, Connecticut, Frank Sprague showed early signs of exceptional aptitude in mathematics and mechanics. After graduating from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, he was commissioned in the Navy, but his interests went far beyond military life. He had an obsession with electrical systems, how current moved, how machines responded, and how technology could transform modern life. In the 1880s, Sprague left the Navy and joined the Edison Company, where he worked directly under Thomas Edison. It was there he honed his skills in engineering and system design. But unlike Edison, Sprague wasn't content with inventing gadgets. He envisioned entire infrastructures. Systems that moved people, not just light bulbs or sound. His first great contribution came not in elevators, but in electric traction, the technology behind electric streetcars. In 1888, he implemented the world's first successful large-scale electric streetcar system in Richmond, Virginia. It revolutionized urban transportation, replacing horse-drawn carriages with clean, reliable electric travel. This success spread rapidly, and within a few years, over 100 cities had adopted his system. But Sprague was just getting started. He soon turned his attention to another vertical challenge. In the late 19th century, buildings were growing taller. Architects and developers dreamed of reaching the skies, but they faced a problem. Steam-powered elevators, then the norm, were heavy, inefficient, and dangerous. They were prone to mechanical failure and difficult to control. The taller the building, the less practical the elevator became. Sprague saw an opportunity. In 1892, he founded the Sprague Electric Elevator Company and began work on a completely new kind of elevator, one powered entirely by electricity. The idea was radical. While others focused on making steam systems safer, Sprague aimed to replace the system altogether. His electric elevator would not rely on bulky engines or hydraulic pressure. Instead, it would use electric motors and controllers to operate more quietly, more smoothly, and more safely. The core of Sprague's innovation lay in automatic control. He developed systems that regulated the speed of the elevator, allowed it to stop precisely at floor levels, and ensured smooth acceleration and deceleration. These features, standard today, were groundbreaking at the time. They allowed elevators to operate faster, more reliably, and, critically, with greater capacity. Buildings could now be taller because elevators could move more people more quickly and more safely. The first electric elevators were installed in major buildings in New York and Chicago. By the turn of the century, Sprague's system had proven its superiority. And with each successful installation, the limits of architecture expanded. The modern skyscraper, with its endless windows and quiet lifts, became possible not because of design alone, but because of Sprague's machines moving invisibly behind the walls. But while Sprague's elevators reshaped cities, his name quietly disappeared from the story. In 1895, Sprague's elevator company merged with the Otis Elevator Company, which already dominated the market with its older steam-based technology. Otis, recognizing the value of Sprague's innovations, absorbed them and gradually rebranded the technology as its own. The company name endured. The inventor did not. As Otis grew into a global brand, Sprague's contribution was folded into corporate history. The public associated the elevator with Elisha Otis, whose 1852 safety brake demonstration had captured imaginations. Otis had created the image. Sprague had made it scalable. Even within engineering circles, Sprague's achievements were often overshadowed by his more flamboyant contemporaries. He had neither the showmanship of Edison nor the marketing prowess of Bell. His legacy was found in blueprints, not headlines. And so, the father of the modern electric elevator was quietly left behind, even as his inventions carried millions of people skyward every day. Later in life, Sprague continued to work on urban transportation systems. He developed early prototypes for automatic train control and advocated for systems thinking in engineering, always focused on the broader integration of technology into everyday life. He held over 270 patents by the time of his death in 1934. Though largely uncelebrated in his time, engineers and historians eventually began to revisit his contributions. In the late 20th century, Sprague was posthumously awarded honors and inducted into halls of fame. His work was studied in universities. His papers, once buried in archives, were re-examined with reverence. Still, outside those circles, his name remained unfamiliar to most. Frank Sprague did not seek celebrity. His machines spoke for him. His vision was quiet, precise, and systemic. Not built for applause, but for permanence. And that permanence remains. Every time an elevator glides to a stop with smooth efficiency, every time a city grows upward instead of outward, a part of Sprague's genius is at work. He gave cities their third dimension, and in return, history nearly forgot him. Elisha Gray's Harmonic Telegraph. On a cold February morning in 1876, two men in different parts of Boston prepared to change the world. One was Alexander Graham Bell. The other was Elisha Gray, a soft-spoken inventor from Ohio. That day, both submitted paperwork to the U.S. Patent Office for a revolutionary idea, the transmission of voice over wire. One would become a household name. The other would be relegated to a footnote. But the story of the telephone does not begin with a phone call. It begins with a telegraph. Elisha Gray was born in 1835 on a farm in Barnesville, Ohio. As a young man, he studied at Oberlin College, where he showed a deep interest in electrical systems. He wasn't a celebrity, nor was he an aggressive self-promoter. He was an engineer's engineer, methodical, precise, and always experimenting. His work focused on improving the tools of the time: telegraphs, relays, transmitters. And in 1874, he created something that pushed the boundaries of what electrical communication could be: the harmonic telegraph. The idea was elegant. Traditional telegraphs could only send one signal at a time over a single wire. Gray wondered, what if multiple tones could be sent simultaneously, each tuned to a different frequency, like musical notes? It would be like sending chords instead of single notes. He developed a system where multiple messages could travel over the same wire without interference, each assigned its own harmonic frequency. For the 19th century, this was a leap forward, a form of multiplexing decades ahead of its time. But in the process of working with vibrating reeds and tune circuits, Gray discovered something else. When a reed vibrated under certain conditions, it didn't just transmit rhythm, it carried tone. Sound, not just code, could travel through the wire. He realized that with the right transmitter and receiver, human speech might be transmitted electrically. He had stumbled into something profound. Gray began developing a new design: a liquid transmitter that modulated electrical signals according to the pressure and tone of the speaker's voice. It was rudimentary, but it worked. His prototype used a diaphragm connected to a conductive liquid. As sound waves pressed on the diaphragm, they changed the electrical resistance in the liquid, producing a variable current that mimicked the vibrations of speech. It was the core principle behind voice transmission. What Gray had was not just an extension of the telegraph. It was something altogether new: the beginnings of the telephone. On February 14, 1876, Gray's lawyer arrived at the U.S. Patent Office with a caveat: a formal notice of intention to file a patent. It described his invention, outlined the principle of variable resistance voice transmission, and was meant to secure his claim while he finalized the application. That same day, just hours earlier, Alexander Graham Bell's patent application, describing a similar invention, was filed. What happened next has been debated ever since. Some argue it was a coincidence. Others suggest that someone in the patent office may have shown Bell's team Gray's caveat, prompting subtle but critical edits to Bell's patent. Whether by chance or maneuvering, the result was decisive. Bell's patent was processed first. It was granted on March 7, 1876. 3 days later, Bell would demonstrate the first successful voice transmission with the famous words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Gray was stunned. He immediately protested, claiming priority. The legal battles that followed would span years. Gray's camp argued that Bell had borrowed the liquid transmitter concept directly from Gray's caveat. Bell denied it. Expert witnesses were called. Testimonies were revised. Allegations surfaced that Bell's attorneys had bribed a patent office employee. But no court ever ruled in Gray's favor. Bell's patent stood. Gray's invention was valid. His work was real. But the patent system did not reward near misses or caveats. In the eyes of the law, Bell was first. And in the eyes of history, Bell became the inventor of the telephone. Gray returned to his engineering work. He moved on to other innovations, including improvements to the teleautograph, an early version of the fax machine, and sound-based devices. He remained respected among engineers, but public recognition eluded him. His name was rarely mentioned in textbooks. His story remained in the margins. In 1876, when Bell was celebrated at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, Gray was not invited. As dignitaries applauded the marvel of voice transmitted over wire, Gray's prototype, the machine that may have done it first, sat silently in his workshop. He died in 1901, largely unknown outside of technical circles. But long after his passing, historians and scientists would revisit the old records. The diagrams, the caveat, the notes. Many agreed Gray had independently, and perhaps even first, discovered the principles of the telephone. But recognition delayed is recognition denied. His invention had been overtaken not by science, but by timing. Today, we live in a world connected by voice, across oceans, across networks, across invisible frequencies. We speak and hear in real time, the result of technologies born in quiet workshops over a century ago. And somewhere in that lineage, between circuits and tones, between code and speech, lives the ghost of Elisha Gray's harmonic telegraph. It was more than a stepping stone. It was a missed moment in history, a voice that might have been first, but never loud enough to be heard. Emile Berliner's flat disc record. In the age before streaming, before compact discs, before even vinyl, there was a sound, fragile, rotating, physical, etched into flat grooves and spun by hand or motor. It was the sound of memory preserved, the beginning of recorded music as we know it. And behind that quiet revolution stood a man named Emile Berliner, whose invention laid the foundation for the entire modern recording industry. Born in 1851 in Hanover, Germany, Berliner immigrated to the United States at the age of 19, arriving with little money but a mind teeming with possibility. He was not a formally trained engineer. He worked odd jobs, as a clerk, a printer, and a dry goods salesman, before landing in a chemical lab where he taught himself acoustics and electronics. By the late 1870s, the telephone had just been invented, and Berliner quickly found himself immersed in experiments to improve it. In 1877, he created the first practical microphone for use with telephones, a device that transformed acoustic pressure into variable electrical signals. That invention earned him recognition and financial stability. But Berliner was never content with improving existing technologies. He wanted to invent something new, something that could preserve sound permanently. At the time, Thomas Edison's phonograph had already astonished the world. It used a rotating cylinder wrapped in tin foil to record sound via indentations made by a stylus. Though groundbreaking, Edison's invention was crude and mechanically unstable. The cylinders were difficult to mass-produce, fragile, and allowed only brief recordings. Berliner had a different vision. He imagined a flat disc recorded laterally, with grooves cut side to side rather than vertically indented. This disc would rotate on a flat turntable and could be pressed easily in large quantities. More importantly, it allowed for longer, more stable recordings. In 1887, Berliner filed a patent for the gramophone, a system that included a sound recording apparatus, a flat disc, and a playback mechanism using a stylus and horn. Unlike Edison, Berliner saw the potential not only as a scientific achievement but as a commercial platform. He established the Berliner Gramophone Company and began producing discs that could be mass-replicated using a zinc master and pressing techniques. It was a small beginning, rough audio fidelity, short durations, but it worked. For the first time, music could be recorded, copied, distributed, and replayed at will. Berliner's system represented the true beginning of the modern music industry. Yet even as the technology advanced, recognition did not follow him. Edison, with his fame and financial power, remained the symbolic face of recorded sound. Others, like Eldridge Johnson and the Victor Talking Machine Company, built on Berliner's foundation but rebranded the products under new names and new patents. Berliner found himself increasingly pushed out of the very industry he had helped to create. By the early 1900s, legal battles began to erode his control. Accusations of patent infringement, internal disputes, and shifting business alliances forced Berliner to relinquish ownership of key assets. His name was removed from many products. Johnson's Victor label rose in prominence, and Edison introduced his own improved disc format, ironically adopting the flat disc concept he had once dismissed. Berliner continued his work in other fields. He invented early versions of the acoustic tile, worked on helicopter propulsion, and engaged in public health campaigns. He remained productive and curious until his death in 1929. But the flat disc, his most world-altering invention, had largely slipped from public association with his name. Decades passed. The gramophone became the turntable. The disc evolved from shellac to vinyl. Music changed form: LPs, 45s, cassette tapes, compact discs, MP3s, and digital streams. But beneath all the layers of innovation, the core idea remained unchanged. A lateral groove inscribed with sound, turning in motion, waiting to be played. It was Berliner who gave the world that shape. Today, the resurgence of vinyl has brought attention back to the format's early days. Collectors speak of warmth, of fidelity, of touch. They admire the physicality of sound etched into matter. And while Edison remains celebrated as the father of recorded audio, it is Berliner who truly built the medium that music lives on. Louis Le Prince's motion picture camera. In the late 19th century, the world stood at the edge of a new visual frontier. Photography had already frozen time into still frames, capturing faces and landscapes in silver and glass. But what if time could flow? What if moments could be recorded as they moved? Gestures, expressions, the fall of light across a living subject. This question consumed a quiet, determined French inventor named Louis Le Prince, long before most others imagined the possibility. Born in Metz, France in 1841, Le Prince was raised in an intellectually rich environment. His father, a respected officer and an acquaintance of Louis Daguerre, exposed him early to the principles of optics and chemical photography. Louis went on to study painting and physics in Paris, then photography and chemistry in Leipzig. His life became a merging of two disciplines: the artistic desire to represent life, and the scientific hunger to capture it with precision. By the 1880s, Le Prince had settled in Leeds, England. There, in a quiet workshop above a carriage factory, he began working on a device that could do what no machine had yet done: record a sequence of images fast enough and accurately enough to recreate the illusion of movement. He designed a single-lens camera that used a strip of sensitized paper film. The mechanism advanced the film after each exposure, allowing for a rapid succession of frames. In 1888, Le Prince filmed what is now widely recognized as the first motion picture. It was called Roundhay Garden Scene. The footage, just a few seconds long, shows members of his family walking in a garden in Leeds. Ordinary movements made extraordinary by the fact that they had been captured, not as stillness, but as motion. Shortly after, he filmed Leeds Bridge, showing bustling foot and carriage traffic from a window. These brief, flickering sequences marked the beginning of a technology that would come to define the 20th century and beyond. But what makes Le Prince's story so different from others is not just the fact of his innovation. It's what happened next. In 1890, Le Prince planned a public demonstration of his invention in the United States. He intended to patent the technology, display it to the press, and secure his place in history. He arranged to travel from Dijon, France, to Paris to catch a train to London, and then onward to New York. But he never arrived. Somewhere between Dijon and the next station, Louis Le Prince vanished. There were no witnesses, no body, no luggage, just an empty train compartment and a list of unanswered questions. Police investigations found nothing. His family was devastated. The public barely noticed. And with no public demonstration, no finalized patents in the U.S., and no formal recognition of his work, Le Prince's claim to the invention of motion pictures quietly faded. 2 years later, in 1892, Thomas Edison introduced his kinetoscope, a single-user viewing device that showed short loops of moving images. In 1895, the Lumière brothers in France publicly projected their films to an audience, widely regarded as the birth of cinema. Both Edison and the Lumières would go on to be credited with the invention of motion pictures. Le Prince's name, for the most part, was forgotten. But his family did not forget. Le Prince's son, Adolphe, spent years fighting for recognition of his father's work. He provided film evidence, written records, and witness testimonies to prove that Louis had achieved moving image capture before any of the others. He challenged Edison's claims in court, bringing forward Le Prince's camera and early film strips as evidence. But the legal system favored established names and documented demonstrations. Without his father present, and with little financial backing, Adolphe could not change the outcome. In a cruel twist, Adolphe himself died under mysterious circumstances in 1901, shot during a hunting trip in what some considered suspicious circumstances, though officially ruled accidental. Whatever hope remained of reclaiming the family legacy was extinguished. It wasn't until decades later, as film historians began to dig into the true origins of cinema, that Le Prince's name resurfaced. His surviving films were analyzed, his camera examined, and his timeline reconstructed. Slowly, a new picture emerged. Louis Le Prince had invented motion pictures first, filmed them first, and intended to present them to the public, but vanished before the world could see. Some speculated that Edison, in his aggressive defense of patents, might have had a motive. Others pointed to commercial rivals or even family conflict. The truth of his disappearance remains unsolved to this day. No body was ever found. His contribution remained absent from most film history for over a century. Today, scholars widely acknowledge Le Prince as the true pioneer of moving pictures. His surviving camera is on display at the National Science and Media Museum in the UK, and his few remaining frames of footage are considered priceless artifacts. But outside of niche historical circles, his name still floats in obscurity. No red carpets, no film awards, no monuments, and yet, every cinematic moment, every film reel, every projection, every digital frame on screen, can trace its ancestry to that garden in Leeds. To the man who, with a painter's eye and an engineer's hand, captured time in motion before the world was ready to see it. Le Prince's story isn't one of rivalry or competition. It's a cautionary tale about how fragile invention can be without recognition, and how easily history overlooks those who work in silence. His vision materialized not through courts or applause, but through the legacy of what he built, even if he wasn't there to see it change the world. Otto Lilienthal's glider technology. In the final decades of the 19th century, flight was still considered a dream reserved for birds and myths. Human beings, bound by gravity and tradition, could only look skyward with longing. But one man in Germany dared to imagine otherwise, not as a poet or fantasist, but as an engineer. His name was Otto Lilienthal, and his work with gliders laid the essential groundwork for the age of aviation. He would come to be known as the Glider King, but for decades his name would drift in the background, eclipsed by the louder triumphs of those who came later, men who flew farther, faster, and into history books. Yet none of them would have left the ground without the man who first showed it could be done. Lilienthal was born in 1848 in Anklam, a small town in Prussia. From childhood, he was fascinated by birds, not just their elegance, but the mechanics of how they moved through air. He and his brother Gustav spent hours observing storks, sketching wings, and imagining how lift, balance, and drag worked together to create flight. While others saw flight as magic, Lilienthal saw it as a solvable equation. He pursued mechanical engineering and applied this knowledge with exacting discipline. For over 20 years, he collected data on the curved shapes of bird wings and performed countless wind tunnel tests using primitive tools of his own design. He didn't want to leap recklessly into the sky. He wanted to understand it first, to build a scientific framework where none yet existed. In 1889, he published Der Vogelflug als Grundlage der Fliegekunst, bird flight as the basis of aviation. The book meticulously analyzed how birds achieved lift and balance, and it became the most important aeronautical study of its time. Unlike many speculative works of the era, Lilienthal's research was backed by mathematics, repeated trials, and observable results. His approach was simple: study nature and imitate it. By the early 1890s, Lilienthal had moved from theory to practice. In the hills outside Berlin, he began testing his first gliders. Constructed from lightweight wood, cloth, and wire, these machines resembled bird wings more than any vehicle. And then, in defiance of centuries of failure and fear, Lilienthal flew. He didn't soar, and he didn't stay airborne for long. But the moment his feet left the ground and his body floated through the air, he achieved what no human had ever done with repeatable control. These weren't stunts or accidents. They were deliberate, measured glides, 10, 20, sometimes 80 meters, always with careful calculation and with a growing understanding of how air could be shaped and ridden. Over the next several years, Lilienthal completed over 2,000 glider flights. He designed at least 16 different models, continually adjusting their form and control surfaces. Each flight was an experiment, and each failure brought him closer to mastering flight's elusive formula. His designs introduced the concept of weight-shift control, in which the pilot altered the center of gravity by moving his body. This principle remains fundamental in modern hang gliders, but his influence extended far beyond the German hills. In distant places, England, France, and America, photographs and diagrams of Lilienthal's flights began to circulate. One image in particular, showing him mid-flight with his winged glider silhouetted against the sky, ignited the imaginations of inventors across the world. Among them were Wilbur and Orville Wright, who later credited Lilienthal's work as their starting point. Wilbur once said, "Of all the men who attacked the flying problem in the 19th century, Otto Lilienthal was easily the most important. Yet despite his caution and method, flight remained perilous." On August 9, 1896, Lilienthal took off for what seemed like a routine test. During the glide, a sudden gust of wind tilted his glider upward. Without modern control systems, he could not correct the angle. The glider stalled and fell from a height of about 15 meters. He was taken to the hospital with a fractured spine. The next day, he died from his injuries. His last reported words were calm and unwavering. "Sacrifices must be made." He was 48 years old. His death sent a chill through the early aviation community. For some, it confirmed their fears that human flight was folly. But for others, Lilienthal's life proved the opposite. That flight was not only possible, but understandable, testable, and achievable. His meticulous records, photographs, and engineering designs survived him and spread across continents. And though his name rarely appeared in newspapers, it echoed in the notebooks of the next generation of aviators. In 1903, 7 years after Lilienthal's final flight, the Wright brothers successfully launched the first powered airplane at Kitty Hawk. They didn't stumble into success. They followed a path Lilienthal had marked, building their own wind tunnel based on his ideas and learning from the lessons he had written down. Without his careful groundwork, powered flight might have arrived years, even decades, later. Still, over time, the names changed. The glory shifted. The Wright brothers became heroes. Santos Dumont, Blériot, Lindbergh, all entered the cultural memory of flight. Lilienthal remained a name known only to specialists and historians, mentioned briefly, if at all, in the stories told to the public. But in every aircraft, in every glider, every drone, every winged vehicle, his principles endure. His curved wing profiles, his center of gravity adjustments, his insistence on data before dreams. They live not in spectacle, but in substance. Otto Lilienthal did not invent powered flight. He did something more foundational. He proved that the air could hold us. Garrett Morgan's gas mask. In the early 20th century, when smoke filled a tunnel or a chemical cloud descended on a battlefield, most people had no chance of escape. The air itself turned lethal, and without warning, breath became poison. At a time when protective equipment was rudimentary or non-existent, few dared to solve the invisible danger of suffocation. One man did. Garrett Augustus Morgan, the son of formerly enslaved parents, was born in 1877 in Paris, Kentucky. With only a 6th-grade education, he left home as a teenager to find work and better opportunities. He settled in Cleveland, Ohio, where he took a job as a sewing machine repairman. At first glance, it seemed like a modest path, repairing belts and threads, but Morgan had a restless mind. He didn't just fix machines, he studied how they worked, how they could be improved, and how their principles might apply to larger challenges. By the 1910s, he had founded his own company and held several patents for mechanical devices, including a hair-straightening product and an improved sewing machine needle. But one invention, born from his growing concern over industrial safety, would prove far more consequential. At the time, fire departments and industrial workers had little to protect them from smoke inhalation. If a fire broke out underground, or toxic fumes escaped in a factory, rescuers often became victims themselves. Morgan envisioned a safety hood, a device that would allow someone to breathe clean air long enough to escape or assist others. In 1912, after extensive testing, Morgan patented a device he called the breathing device. It consisted of a canvas hood placed over the head, connected to long rubber tubes that hung downward. These tubes reached near the ground, where the air was cooler and less filled with smoke. A sponge inside the device helped filter out particulates. Though primitive by today's standards, Morgan's hood worked, reliably and effectively, even in thick smoke. He began demonstrating the invention at safety exhibitions and public events. But Morgan, as a black man in a deeply segregated America, faced immediate skepticism. Audiences and potential clients often dismissed him or ignored the invention outright. In some cases, he resorted to hiring a white actor to play the role of inventor, while Morgan himself posed as the demonstrator or assistant. The device was shown under the name G.A. Morgan Safety Hood and Smoke Protector, but Morgan's face was deliberately left out of the brochures. Everything changed on July 24, 1916. A gas explosion occurred inside a tunnel under Lake Erie in Cleveland. The explosion released clouds of smoke and toxic gas, trapping several workers deep underground. Multiple rescue attempts failed. One after another, firefighters and police officers were overcome by the fumes. The situation seemed hopeless. When Morgan heard about the disaster, he grabbed several of his hoods and rushed to the scene with his brother. Without waiting for official permission, they descended into the tunnel themselves. Wearing his breathing device, Morgan entered the smoke-filled tunnel and emerged minutes later with 2 survivors. He went back again and again. In total, Morgan helped rescue more than a dozen men from certain death. His invention had proved itself in the harshest, most public way possible. The rescue made headlines, but in the reporting, Morgan's role was often minimized or erased entirely. Some newspapers credited unnamed volunteers. Others mentioned the invention but not the inventor. When Morgan's identity became known, city officials and business leaders were reluctant to give full credit. The discomfort of acknowledging a black inventor in a white-dominated field overpowered the reality of what had occurred. Morgan continued to promote his safety hood, selling it to fire departments and rescue units. The U.S. Army adopted versions of the device during World War I, using it as a template for early gas masks. But Morgan never received major military contracts, nor was his name elevated to the status of national hero. His invention, though it saved lives, remained in the background of American innovation. He went on to develop other important technologies, including a 3-position traffic signal that added a caution phase between stop and go, a system that became the standard in traffic lights worldwide. He also became the first black man in Cleveland to own an automobile. But despite his accomplishments, racial barriers persisted. In the 1920s and 1930s, Morgan tried to gain broader recognition. He wrote letters to newspapers, displayed his inventions at expositions, and gave interviews. But the industrial world remained indifferent. He was never offered corporate partnerships or institutional support. His patents were copied or adapted with little legal recourse. Later in life, Morgan began to lose his eyesight, reportedly due to exposure to chemicals from his experiments. He died in 1963 at the age of 86, the same year as the March on Washington and just before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. By that time, the safety hood had already been replaced by newer gas mask designs, and few outside of Cleveland remembered the man behind it. But his contributions did not disappear. In time, educators and historians rediscovered Morgan's patents, his public demonstrations, and his role in the Lake Erie rescue. Schools were named after him. His breathing hood was recognized as a vital predecessor to modern gas masks. In 2005, he was posthumously inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Slowly, his legacy began to resurface, not as a side note, but as a central figure in the history of public safety and mechanical innovation. Garrett Morgan did not seek celebrity. His work was utilitarian, focused on solving real problems for real people. He entered smoke-filled tunnels when others would not. He looked past discrimination and kept building. And while others received praise for lesser inventions, Morgan's greatest contributions remained uncelebrated during his lifetime. But today, every firefighter who breathes clean air in a burning building, every soldier equipped with a modern mask, and every worker protected from toxic fumes, moves in the shadow of Morgan's work. Benjamin Bradley's steam engine for warships. In the depths of the 19th century, when steam began to replace sails and the world's navies entered a new era of industrial might, one man quietly reshaped marine propulsion. His name was Benjamin Bradley, and although his invention helped usher in a new age of steam-powered warships, He lived and died in near obscurity, not because his work was unremarkable, but because he was born enslaved. Bradley's early life is sparsely documented, as is often the case with individuals born into slavery. He was born around 1830 in Maryland, a state that still allowed human ownership under the law. From a young age, it became clear that Bradley possessed an unusual gift. He showed a natural aptitude for mechanics, mathematics, and precision, abilities that could neither be taught nor dismissed. Even as a child, he built toy steam engines using whatever scrap metal he could find. Those around him noticed. Eventually, his talent brought him to the attention of officials at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which had been established in 1845. Bradley was not allowed to enroll. The institution barred African Americans, enslaved or free, but he was permitted to work there as a laborer and later as a technician in the physics department. In that setting, surrounded by naval engineers, technical documents, and live machinery, Bradley flourished. While working in the Naval Academy's workshops, he began to design and construct increasingly complex steam engines. Using discarded parts and salvaged materials, he built a working model of a steam engine entirely by hand. His superiors were impressed, not only by the functionality of the engine but by its efficiency and compact design, essential qualities for propulsion on warships, where space and weight were at a premium. Bradley didn't stop there. In his own time, often outside working hours, he engineered a larger steam engine, powerful enough to drive the propeller of a small ship. This was not a theoretical model. It was a real working engine developed without formal education, without a blueprint, and without the freedom to profit from it. As an enslaved man, Bradley could not legally apply for a patent, nor could he claim full ownership of his creation. According to the law, anything he built belonged not to him, but to the man who owned him. Nevertheless, the Navy recognized the value of his work. They granted Bradley a position as an assistant, a rare title for a black man in that era, and paid him a small wage, a portion of which he used to purchase his freedom. It was an extraordinary achievement. A man born into bondage had bought his liberty using the power of his mind and the machines he created with his hands. Once free, Bradley continued to work on steam propulsion systems and marine engines. He was one of the first African-American engineers to work directly on U.S. naval technology, though his name was absent from official patent records or engineering journals. His contributions were folded into government use and gradually absorbed by larger military engineering efforts. As the 19th century progressed, steam engines became the beating heart of naval power. Massive warships no longer depended on wind or tide. They moved through water with precision, speed, and reliability. Propellers replaced sails. Steel replaced wood. And behind that transformation was the work of many, known and unknown, including Benjamin Bradley. But Bradley's story was never widely told. Unlike other inventors of the era, he did not leave behind volumes of technical writing or published memoirs. He did not tour the country giving lectures, nor did he build a company bearing his name. His inventions were absorbed into government and military infrastructure, leaving little trace of his identity in the public record. There were no monuments erected in his honor. No ships bore his name. For generations, his work was mentioned only in passing, often without acknowledging the full context of his life. But over time, historians began to reassemble the pieces. Through Naval Academy records, personal testimonies, and fragments of archival documents, Bradley's role became clearer, not as a minor assistant, but as a central figure in early American marine engineering. Today, he is often cited as one of the first African-American inventors to contribute directly to military technology. His work predates the formal inclusion of black scientists and engineers in U.S. defense institutions. And yet, even now, few outside of academic circles know his name. Bradley lived through a time when legal ownership of one's own ideas was forbidden for people of his background. The notion that an enslaved man could contribute to the advancement of one of the world's most powerful naval forces was unthinkable to many at the time. And yet, that is exactly what he did. In a world that offered him no title, no patent, and no stage, Benjamin Bradley quietly redefined what was possible, not only for engineering but for human dignity. He took the very systems built to suppress him and turned them into platforms for innovation. His engines powered vessels designed for war, but his life's work was an act of peace, the slow, steady resistance of knowledge against oppression. Leo Szilard's nuclear chain reaction. In the quiet streets of London, on a rainy September morning in 1933, a man stood at a traffic light, waiting to cross the road. He was not in a laboratory. He wasn't seated before a chalkboard. And yet, in that brief, unremarkable moment, Leo Szilard imagined something that would alter the fate of nations, an idea that would lead directly to the nuclear age. Szilard was born in Budapest, Hungary, in 1898. From a young age, he showed a formidable intelligence, restless, precise, and inquisitive. He studied engineering and then physics, working alongside the great minds of early 20th century science, Albert Einstein, Max Born, and Werner Heisenberg. But while many of his contemporaries remained in academia, Szilard's thinking reached beyond the boundaries of the university. He didn't just seek to understand the world. He wanted to anticipate where it was going. By the early 1930s, Europe was shifting dangerously. The rise of fascism, growing political instability, and an exodus of Jewish scientists, including Szilard himself, were signs of a world preparing for war. Szilard, then in exile in London, spent much of his time contemplating the relationship between science and power. He had read an article in the Times by physicist Ernest Rutherford, dismissing the idea of extracting usable energy from atoms. Szilard disagreed not emotionally, but logically. He believed it was possible. The question was how. And then came that moment at the traffic light. Szilard later described it plainly. As he waited to cross, the idea struck him. If an atom could be split in such a way that it released neutrons, and if those neutrons could go on to split other atoms, it could trigger a chain reaction, an exponential release of energy, far beyond anything chemical reactions could produce. It wasn't just a scientific insight. It was a new kind of force, potentially capable of powering cities or destroying them. Szilard immediately began to theorize how such a reaction might be initiated and sustained. He envisioned a device that could maintain a self-sustaining fission process. But theory alone was not enough. He sought materials, collaborators, and a path forward. At the time, uranium was the most promising candidate. It could, under specific conditions, emit neutrons when bombarded. But no one had yet demonstrated an actual chain reaction. Szilard filed a patent in 1934, not under his own name but assigned to the British Admiralty to keep it secret. He feared what such technology could become if misused, even as it existed only in sketches and notes. He was one of the first scientists to realize that nuclear fission was not just a breakthrough, it was a weapon waiting to be built. In 1938, a major turning point arrived. Two German physicists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, discovered that bombarding uranium with neutrons could split its nucleus, producing lighter elements and releasing a large amount of energy. Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, working in Sweden, correctly interpreted this as nuclear fission. The pieces of Szilard's theory were now falling into place, and fast. When Szilard learned of this, he understood the implications immediately. If he could grasp it, so could scientists in Nazi Germany. The race was on. In 1939, Szilard approached Albert Einstein, convincing him to sign a letter to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter warned that Germany might be developing nuclear weapons and urged the United States to begin its own research. It was Szilard's words, Einstein's signature, and that letter which set the foundation for the Manhattan Project, the American program to develop the atomic bomb. Ironically, Szilard was not interested in building the bomb. He wanted to prevent it. As the Manhattan Project grew, Szilard joined the effort, working at the University of Chicago, where the first nuclear reactor, Chicago Pile 1, went critical under the leadership of Enrico Fermi in 1942. The chain reaction was now no longer theoretical. It had been achieved. Safely, quietly, under a squash court at Stagg Field, a new era had begun. Szilard had helped design and control the reactor. But as the bomb came closer to reality, he grew increasingly alarmed. He saw the direction the program was taking, toward weaponization, not peaceful use. In 1945, as the war neared its end, Szilard circulated a petition among Manhattan Project scientists, urging the U.S. government not to use the bomb on civilian populations in Japan. He argued for a demonstration instead, a test that would display its power without mass destruction. His petition never reached President Truman. When the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Szilard was devastated. He had helped create the chain reaction, and now that reaction had moved beyond physics. It had become political, ethical, and irreversible. After the war, Szilard turned his attention to nuclear disarmament, international cooperation, and bioethics. He co-founded the Council for a Livable World, advocated for arms control, and warned against the unchecked proliferation of nuclear weapons. He also shifted fields entirely, moving into molecular biology and proposing early ideas about information storage in DNA. Always, he moved ahead of his time. Szilard died in 1964, largely uncelebrated by the public. His name was rarely spoken in the same breath as Oppenheimer, Fermi, or Einstein, yet his vision had preceded them all, not just in imagining the chain reaction, but in foreseeing what it meant. He never sought fame, nor accepted its consequences lightly. He wrestled with what he had helped unleash, and spent the rest of his life trying to contain it. In the end, Szilard's story is not just one of invention. It is a story of caution, of intellect shaped by conscience. The chain reaction he imagined at a London crosswalk was not just a scientific principle. It was a metaphor for what ideas become when passed from one person to the next, when they are no longer controlled by their creator, and when they move irreversibly into the world. Harvey Fletcher's stereophonic sound. Before music could surround us, before it could move through a room and feel alive, there was only one direction for sound: straight ahead. Early recordings played through a single speaker, flattening complex audio into a monophonic stream. Instruments clashed. Space collapsed. The warmth of a concert hall, the subtle distance between voices and strings, vanished into a narrow window of sound. But in the early 20th century, long before surround sound became commonplace, one man envisioned something different. He imagined a world where sound could be reconstructed as it truly exists, not in a straight line but as a landscape. His name was Harvey Fletcher, and his work would lay the groundwork for stereophonic sound, the kind of audio that wraps around the listener and restores depth, dimension, and presence. Harvey Fletcher was born in 1884 in Provo, Utah. A gifted student, he studied physics at Brigham Young University and later earned his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago in 1911, one of the first in the country to do so in physics. Shortly after, he joined Bell Telephone Laboratories, a place where ideas about sound, communication, and electrical engineering collided. Fletcher was curious about the nature of hearing, not just how machines captured sound, but how humans perceived it. What made a voice intelligible? What gave music its richness? Why did live performances sound so different from recorded ones? These questions led him into psychoacoustics, the study of how we experience sound, not just how it is measured. He began to focus on binaural hearing, the way our two ears pick up different audio signals, which the brain uses to infer direction, distance, and space. This understanding would later prove fundamental to what we now call stereo. In the 1920s and 1930s, Fletcher conducted groundbreaking experiments. He worked on hearing aids, telephony, and, most notably, electrical sound recording. His collaboration with Western Electric and Victor Talking Machine Company helped transition the recording industry from mechanical to electrical methods, resulting in clearer, more dynamic recordings. But his most visionary work came later, in a series of experiments designed to recreate spatial sound. Fletcher and his team developed a method of recording with multiple microphones placed at different positions in a concert hall. Each microphone captured sound from a slightly different angle, much like how our ears pick up sound in the real world. When played back through two or more speakers positioned strategically, the result was startling. Instead of sound emerging from a single point, it appeared to exist in three-dimensional space. Instruments could now be located, violins to the left, cellos to the right, a soloist front and center. The illusion of space had been restored. In 1933, Fletcher organized a public demonstration of this stereophonic sound at Carnegie Hall. Audiences sat in astonishment as they listened to a performance of the Philadelphia Orchestra not live, but recorded, and yet it sounded live. The directionality, the realism, the emotional presence. It was unlike anything they had heard from a speaker before. But the world was not quite ready. The Great Depression had tightened budgets. The equipment required to reproduce stereo sound was expensive and complex. Most radios and phonographs used a single speaker. Commercial interest faded. Fletcher's work, though brilliant, was considered too ahead of its time. Over the next decades, stereophonic principles were quietly shelved in favor of mass-market monophonic sound. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s, with the rise of home hi-fi systems, that stereo began to reemerge. Record labels and speaker manufacturers rediscovered Fletcher's concepts. His early work was dusted off, studied, and quietly implemented. The music industry shifted. By the 1970s, stereo had become standard. But by then, Harvey Fletcher's name was largely absent from the public conversation. Others took credit. His contributions were filed away under corporate patents or buried in technical archives. Even today, few listeners realize that the spaciousness of their favorite song, the feeling that the drums are behind them or the piano slightly to the right, can be traced directly to experiments conducted nearly a century ago by a physicist obsessed with how we hear. Beyond stereo, Fletcher also contributed to early hearing aid development, audiometry, and the decibel scale, a logarithmic unit still used to measure sound intensity. His research formed the bedrock of how engineers today calibrate everything from headphones to concert halls. He passed away in 1981 at the age of 97. During his life, he received recognition from scientific institutions but remained largely unknown to the general public. Unlike famous inventors of audio hardware or musicians who made headlines, Fletcher remained in the background, a scientist quietly shaping how the world would sound. Today, every stereo track, every headphone experience, every cinematic surround mix, every live album that gives the illusion of being there, bears the imprint of his work. His studies in psychoacoustics still inform algorithms in spatial audio, gaming, virtual reality, and modern sound engineering. But Fletcher didn't invent stereo to impress. He didn't chase entertainment. He simply wanted to bring sound closer to reality, to match the way we naturally hear with the way machines could reproduce it. He believed that technology should not just transmit sound, but preserve its meaning. That in restoring space to sound, we restore the emotional nuance that makes it human. László Bíró's ballpoint pen. In an age when ink was delicate, slow, and prone to smudging, writing was a fragile act. A slip of the hand, a spill of the inkwell, or a sudden blot could undo the precision of thought. For centuries, people wrote with quills, nibs, and fountain pens, elegant tools that demanded patience and care. But then, in the first half of the 20th century, one man decided that writing could be something more. Faster, cleaner, and universal. His name was László Bíró, and his invention would become the most common writing instrument in the world. Bíró was born in 1899 in Budapest, Hungary, a city at the edge of old Europe and new ideas. He worked as a journalist, spending long hours with pen and paper, scribbling notes in the rush of newsrooms and editing desks. He grew frustrated by the limitations of fountain pens. The leaking, the smearing, the long drying times that turned every sentence into a risk. What he needed was a pen that flowed like thought. Smooth, consistent, and immediate. While watching a printing press one day, Bíró noticed something. The ink used in newspapers was thick and fast-drying, unlike the watery ink in pens. But it couldn't flow through a fountain pen's narrow nib. It was too viscous. That problem, however, also held the key. If the ink was thicker, perhaps the mechanism itself needed to change. Together with his brother Georgi, a chemist, László began experimenting. What they devised was simple in concept but elegant in design. A pen with a tiny metal ball bearing at the tip, held snugly in a socket. As the pen moved across paper, the ball rotated, picking up ink from an internal reservoir and applying it evenly onto the page. It was this rolling motion, not pressure, that delivered ink. In 1938, Bíró filed for a patent on the invention. The pen didn't leak. It didn't smudge. It didn't require refilling every day. And best of all, it could write smoothly on nearly any surface, not just high-grade paper. What László and Georgi had created was a revolution disguised as a tool. But Europe was on the brink of war. As fascism spread and persecution of Jews intensified, the Bíró brothers, who were Jewish, fled Hungary. They sought safety in Argentina, where they continued to develop the pen and secured a new patent in 1943. There, they partnered with businessman Juan Jorge Maine and launched production of the Bíró, a name formed from Bíró and Maine. The pen caught attention for its practicality, but real momentum didn't come until a very different kind of interest arrived. The Royal Air Force. During World War II, British pilots struggled to write in cockpits using fountain pens, which leaked or failed at high altitudes due to air pressure changes. Ballpoint pens, with their sealed design and thick ink, functioned perfectly in flight. The RAF placed large orders, and Bíró's invention became not just a civilian convenience but a military asset. After the war, major manufacturers took notice. In 1945, American businessman Milton Reynolds visited Argentina and acquired a version of the ballpoint design. He returned to the United States and introduced the Reynolds Rocket, the first commercially available ballpoint pen in the U.S. It sold rapidly, advertised as a miracle pen that could write underwater, over grease, and for miles without stopping. Competitors soon followed. In Europe, the French firm Bic licensed the Bíró patent and launched the Bic Cristal, which became the most widely used pen in the world. But through it all, László Bíró himself was largely forgotten by the public. His name was not attached to the flashy branding or mass marketing campaigns. His original patent was outpaced by aggressive business expansion and global commercialization. While companies earned millions, Bíró earned little more than a modest licensing fee. He never built a global empire. He never trademarked his name as a brand. And yet, in many languages, from French to English to Hebrew, the word Bíró is still used to mean ballpoint pen. He continued to live quietly in Buenos Aires, where he worked on other inventions and lived without wealth or fame. He never stopped inventing. He registered over 20 patents in various fields, but none ever matched the quiet, universal impact of the ballpoint. Today, over 100 billion ballpoint pens have been produced. They are found in school desks and office drawers, prisons and war zones, homes and factories. They are the silent companions of grocery lists, love letters, blueprints, exams, and peace treaties. They are disposable, almost invisible in daily life, so commonplace that we forget someone had to invent them. But behind every line written with a ballpoint is the legacy of László Bíró, a man who simply wanted to write without interruption. His was not a quest for wealth, but for utility. His genius was not in dreaming of a distant future, but in solving a problem that everyone shared, yet no one had fixed. On September 29th, Argentina celebrates Inventors' Day, not for a local industrialist or politician, but in honor of Bíró's birthday. Quiet recognition for a man who, despite war and exile, gave the world something it didn't know it needed, and now cannot live without. Percy Julian's synthetic hormones. In the quiet rhythm of a laboratory, where glassware clinks and vapors rise, the most transformative revolutions often occur unseen. No great machines, no thunderous applause, just patience, precision, and a mind determined to unlock nature's secrets. Such was the world of Percy Levon Julian, a chemist whose work with synthetic hormones changed medicine forever, even as society resisted his presence at every turn. Julian was born in 1899 in Montgomery, Alabama, the grandson of formerly enslaved people. At the time, segregation ruled the American South with an iron grip. Black children were rarely educated beyond 8th grade. Yet Julian's parents believed in learning. They filled their home with books and expectations that defied the era's limits. Despite systemic barriers, Julian was accepted to DePauw University in Indiana. He was underprepared compared to his white classmates. He hadn't received proper high school education, but he worked relentlessly, often rising before dawn to study and staying up through the night. He graduated as valedictorian, Phi Beta Kappa. His brilliance was undeniable, but even then, doors remained closed. He was denied entry to graduate school programs in the United States because of his race. He eventually earned a master's degree from Harvard, but was not allowed to pursue a PhD there. It would take several more years and a fellowship in Europe before he completed his doctorate in chemistry at the University of Vienna. By the time he returned to America, Julian was armed with world-class education and cutting-edge knowledge of organic chemistry. But still, finding employment as a black scientist in the 1930s proved almost impossible. Universities refused to hire him in faculty roles. Research institutions passed him over. And so he did what many overlooked minds have done. He persisted anyway. In 1936, Julian was hired by Glidden, a paint and chemical company in Chicago. It wasn't academia, but it gave him access to a laboratory and resources. And it was there, among the byproducts of soybean processing, that he saw an opportunity. Julian had discovered that soybeans contained compounds that could be used to synthesize complex human hormones, substances like progesterone, testosterone, and later cortisone. At the time, these hormones were rare and expensive. Cortisone, for example, could reduce inflammation and was a potential treatment for arthritis and autoimmune disorders. But it was extracted from animal glands in minute quantities, making it prohibitively costly. Julian's breakthrough came in finding a way to produce it synthetically and in bulk using plant steroids as raw material. He developed a method to isolate stigmasterol from soybeans, a plant-based molecule structurally similar to human hormones. Through a series of complex chemical steps, he converted stigmasterol into progesterone and testosterone. These synthetic versions were chemically identical to the natural hormones, but far easier to manufacture. The implications were immediate. Suddenly, drugs that once cost thousands of dollars could be made affordably. Hospitals could offer hormonal treatments to more patients. Pharmaceutical companies adopted his methods, and the medical industry was transformed. Julian's work laid the foundation for modern steroid chemistry, including the development of birth control pills, fertility treatments, and anti-inflammatory medications. But despite his genius, Julian faced constant discrimination. When he moved with his family into the Chicago suburb of Oak Park, his home was firebombed twice. The police offered limited protection. Neighbors circulated petitions to drive him out. But Julian stayed. He rebuilt, and he kept going to the lab each morning. In 1953, he left Glidden and founded Julian Laboratories, one of the first black-owned scientific companies in the United States. His firm supplied steroid intermediates to major drug companies, and within years, it became a multimillion-dollar operation. Eventually, he sold the company and used his wealth to support civil rights causes, education, and science initiatives for underrepresented students. By the end of his life, Julian held over 130 chemical patents, had published widely in scientific journals, and had become one of the most influential organic chemists of the 20th century. Yet public recognition was slow. His name was not as well known as those of Salk, Fleming, or Watson and Crick, though his impact was just as profound. Julian didn't invent hormones. He made them available. He transformed them from rare biological curiosities into tools that could be used by doctors around the world. Millions have benefited from his work: patients with arthritis, hormonal disorders, fertility issues, and inflammatory diseases. And yet, few know the face behind the treatment. In 1973, the National Academy of Sciences finally elected him as the second Black American member in its history. Just 2 years later, he died of liver cancer at age 76. But his legacy continues not only in medicine, but in the idea that science, when combined with perseverance, can overcome even the most deeply rooted barriers. Julian's lab coat was both a symbol of scientific rigor and a kind of armor. He wore it through fire, literal and social, and emerged as one of the quiet architects of modern medicine. Today, every time a child receives a corticosteroid for asthma, every time a patient with arthritis moves without pain, every time hormonal therapies offer hope, they walk in the wake of Percy Julian's work, steady, silent, and life-altering. Ending. As we come to the end of this quiet journey through forgotten brilliance and stolen genius, it's worth taking a moment to reflect. These weren't just inventions. They were fragments of human potential, often ignored, buried, or claimed by others. And yet, each one helped shape the world we live in today. If you found yourself drawn into these stories, if you paused, even for a moment, to wonder how different things might have been, consider supporting this channel. A like, a comment, or a share helps others discover the same quiet space you've just traveled through. And if you haven't yet, subscribing is the simplest way to join us again. For the next journey, the next idea, the next voice that deserves to be heard. Thank you for being here, and thank you for remembering with us.